Welcome to Assets and Hierarchy Overview, presented by AssetWise, Avara Performance Management. By the end of this unit, you will know what assets are, understand how physical assets are represented in APM, know how alternate hierarchies are used, know how to change the position of assets in the hierarchy, and understand what asset classifications are and how they are used. Introduction to assets. What are assets? Assets are physical pieces of equipment that an organization needs to operate and maintain in order to meet its operations effectiveness goals. This supports the strategy development portion of the APM process, where assets that are causing the most organizational concern are selected for identifying risk and performance targets. An asset hierarchy is a graphical representation of an organization's assets and their relationships. Assets in their hierarchy can be extracted from a CMMS and converted into APM, or built from scratch in APM. So, assets are something that you need to maintain. For assets, you can collect health and condition indicators, collect work history, and track reliability data. An asset can be equipment such as pumps, motors, fans, and heaters, collections of equipment such as systems and subsystems. They can be organizational, a department, an area, a cost center, or plant. Assets can be physical locations such as pumping location or a generator location, and assets may include assemblies and components, buildings, areas, grounds, etc. Asset hierarchies. Assets are usually organized into a hierarchy. This is a critical structure in APM. A hierarchy establishes the relevant parent and child relationships between physical pieces of equipment. The key purpose in having a hierarchical format is to provide a means of storing asset, program, and equipment condition information in a way that makes it easy for area maintenance and operations personnel to manage and access it. In a hierarchy, assets can be organized into multiple levels. Let's look at an example of an asset hierarchy. Company ABC is a corporation that is organized into Western and Eastern divisions. Within each division, there are several plants and areas. In each plant, as an example, there are a number of systems. One system is made up of several subsystems, such as Assembly 1 and Assembly number 2. For each assembly, there are a number of assets, such as pumps and motors. Here is an example of an asset hierarchy where there are multiple divisions, regions, plants, and assets. Here is another example of a hierarchy. This is an example of a cooling water system. It includes a tank, several pump assemblies, pipes and valves, etc. In APM, these assets are represented in a hierarchy. A comprehensive asset hierarchy is more than a simple list of assets. When the asset hierarchy is constructed, you should identify all the physical assets that contribute to the goals of the organization, define the level at which work is performed on assets, define the level at which information about assets, such as work history, is tracked, and define a proper parent-child relationship for each asset so that information collected from the hierarchy is useful. When you enter assets into APM, you can organize them into up to 5 different hierarchies. The first hierarchy is the physical hierarchy, also known as Hierarchy 1. Most, if not all, of your assets should be included in this hierarchy. Ideally, the lowest level of the physical hierarchy is usually the level at which you collect indicator readings, write work orders, and collect costs. Items lower than this level generally do not appear in the hierarchy. They are included as parts for an asset. The other 4 alternate hierarchies can be used to make it easier for groups of people to view assets in a specific way. These alternate hierarchies can be set up differently than the physical hierarchy if costs are to be tracked differently. For example, the accounting department may want to track costs by department. If departments are not included in the physical hierarchy, you can set up a financial asset hierarchy. Alternate asset hierarchies do not display locations and installed components in the same way as the physical hierarchy. You cannot install components into locations in alternate hierarchies. Instead, in the alternate hierarchy, you must add components directly into the hierarchy as children of other assets. Each hierarchy is maintained independently. For example, although a component may be removed in the physical hierarchy, it will still appear in the alternate hierarchies to which it was added. Costs independently roll up each alternate hierarchy based on its structure. Here is an example. In hierarchy 1, asset 1 will show the cost for assets 2 and 3 only, while asset 4 will show costs for assets 5 and 6 only. In hierarchy 2, asset 1 shows a cost for assets 2, 3, 5, and 6, while asset 4 shows only its own costs. Hierarchies created in APM are represented graphically on the Assets view. Installed components are shown with the component's location in the hierarchy. The component location is shown first, and both the asset status and installed component are shown in brackets beside the location. The asset's hierarchy code identifies where the asset is in the physical hierarchy. APM automatically constructs a hierarchy location based on the hierarchy code entered for each asset. The hierarchy code is a string of up to 10 letters and/or numbers that identify an individual asset. Each hierarchy code is separated by a dot. For example, a discharge valve asset is created with a hierarchy code of DISV. Based on its parent asset and hierarchy structure, you can reorganize how assets are positioned in the hierarchy. This may be necessary to correct an entry in the hierarchy. For example, you may need to change a child asset to a peer asset. You can use APM drag and drop functionality to move an asset in the hierarchy, or use the arrow buttons to move and reorder nodes in the hierarchy tree. Additionally, you can right-click the asset and change its parent asset. Let's see how this can be done. It is important that you realize the impact of changing the position of assets in the hierarchy. If transactions have already been processed for the asset in its current position, you may need to manually correct the posting in order to maintain the indicator, work order, and costing information. Asset classification. Assets have properties, functionality, and characteristics that need to be set up and tracked. The asset properties include the asset type, the classification, the asset priority, its function, and asset failure statistics. The properties often determine what you can and cannot do with the asset in the system. By using asset properties, you can categorize and filter certain data on an asset. This allows you to use the data in APM to satisfy your business requirements in your asset reliability program. We will take a brief look at asset classification. Asset classification is a way to group assets in order to control what you want to do with the asset. The classification affects how APM treats the asset. The classification is associated to a specific asset type. There are a number of system-defined classifications. They are organization, maintainable, component, component location, asset group, system, and subsystem. An organization asset represents an organization unit within a site. Use this classification for areas, buildings, or departments. Let's look at an example of an organization asset classification. We have a garage whose asset type is building, structure. The garage in APM is set with this asset type. The garage classification is an organization. Child assets of the garage are vehicles that are parked in the garage. An asset that is classified as maintainable is a piece of equipment, a system or a subsystem on which maintenance will be performed. Maintainable assets have a physical location. Its parent is either an organization asset or another maintainable asset. An example of a maintainable asset is a vehicle, a car. The asset type is vehicle. Its parent asset is the garage. A car has a number of systems such as an engine system, a coolant system, the brake system, and so on. All of these systems are child assets of the car. When you consider the garage, the car, and the car's systems, the hierarchy may look like this. There are other asset classifications to discuss as well. A component is an asset classification. It is a piece of equipment on which maintenance will be performed and which can be removed and replaced by a similar unit. A component asset can be moved from one location to another. An example of a component is a motor, which can be removed, rebuilt, and then installed in another location. Where the component is installed is called a component location. This is a physical location that houses the component. An additional asset classification is the asset group. Asset groups are used to collect and organize groups of similar assets. For example, an asset group classification may be used to group all motors of a similar horsepower together. It is important to note that an asset group is not a physical piece of equipment. It groups other types of assets in the hierarchy. We will review asset classifications and look at additional asset properties in an upcoming module. Let's review what you have learned. Assets are something that an organization needs to operate and maintain in order to meet its operations effectiveness goals. Health conditions, indicator readings, work history, reliability data, and costs are all tracked for assets. Identifying the risks that assets present supports the strategy development portion of the APM process. Assets are organized in a hierarchy. The most common hierarchy is the physical hierarchy, but several alternate hierarchies can be set up and used. Asset classifications are used to group assets in order to control what you want or can do with the asset. The classification affects how APM treats the asset. There are a number of system-defined classifications that can be used. At the conclusion of this module, you now know what assets are, how physical assets are represented in APM, how alternate hierarchies are used, how to change the organization of assets in the hierarchy, and what asset classifications are. This concludes the Asset and Hierarchy Overview module.